We focus on rising debt levels globally and in sub-Saharan Africa as well as Nigeria. This really is not a new trend, as debt levels are also growing even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But Nigeria has been recognized to have a double challenge of low revenue base and a huge infrastructure gap. While the government has remained committed to infrastructure development with significant improvements recorded over the years, the country's revenue to GDP ratio has remained low at 9% compared to the comparable countries like Ghana with 12.5%, Kenya 16.6%, Angola 20.9%, and South Africa at 25.2%. However, the absence of fiscal revenues to cover capital and recurrent annual budget expenditure have also led to the rise in debt profile for the federal government and also state government. It would also interest you to note that, according to the latest report from the Debt Management Office, the total amount of domestic debt owed by state governments and the Federal Capital Territory rose to 6.43 trillion naira at the end of last year, with states like Lagos, Ogun Rivers, Akwa Ibom, and Imo State emerging as the top 5 debtors with a combined domestic debt stock of about 1.56 trillion naira. Now, with the rising debt levels of the states, the big question begging for an answer now is what are the major challenges, especially at subnational levels, regarding the efficiency and management of debt. Well, to discuss this and much more and provide some answers and solutions, I have joining me virtually fiscal policy partner and Africa tax leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Taiwo Oyedele. Thank you very much for joining us on the show this afternoon, Mr. Oyedele.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, looking at the fact that rising debt levels globally and also within the sub-Saharan and African region and even in Nigeria is not necessarily a new trend, but the bigger focus that we have now is that we are having the Russia-Ukraine crisis also exacerbates this pressure. Now, for a country like Nigeria, where we have a bigger issue to contend with, which is that Nigeria has issues around low revenue generation base, and then this huge infrastructure gap we have to deal with. How do you see this Russia-Ukraine crisis fueling this downward spiral of borrowing and also increasing our debt levels at this point in time?
Yeah, thank you very much. You're right. At the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, we had a roundtable on debt management. Our focus was really West Africa, but the reality is that these issues tend to cut across the continent and even by extension to the rest of the world, whether you're a developed country or a developing economy or somewhere in between. So we all had to grapple with the challenges posed by COVID-19 over the past 2 to 3 years. Unfortunately, now we're having to deal with Russia-Ukraine, which is affecting the world in many ways than one, in the way that we had not thought about before the war started. So we're having, many countries having to even roll back some of the taxes on energy costs just to be able to assure their citizens that they can be able to afford. And we have countries like Nigeria where instead of smiling to the bank, we're actually sad because the hole in our budget and revenue seems to be growing bigger because of the subsidy, particularly for petrol. Such that the amount of the money accruing to the federation accounts available to the 3 tiers of government is significantly reduced. Now, if you put all of this within the context of the fact that our tax to revenue, our tax to GDP ratio, I should say, is still about 6%. If you look at only tax, which is really the revenue that is sustainable. And then you look at, you just oppose that to the level of debt. While the amount of debt is not, alarming, if you look at the ratio of debt to GDP, you'll be extremely concerned if you then interrogate the level of debt service cost to revenue ratio. So at the federal government level, this is somewhere sometimes between 70%. In some months and quarters, it's gone up to over 90%. At the state level, we don't seem to have a lot of visibility, but if you look at the reports that the Debt Management Office released about the debt profile of states as at the end of 2021. States are owing about 6.5 trillion if you combine the external and domestic debts. And the IGR, the internally generated revenue of all the states in Nigeria combined for 2020, the 2021 figures are not out as of yet. For 2020 was 1.3 trillion. If we assume that the cost of the borrowing for the state is average of 10%, it's likely to be higher. You are easily looking at a debt service ratio to revenue of 50% or more, even at the state level. So what has happened over the past few years is that our debt has been growing faster than our GDP, and our debt service ratio or cost has been growing faster than our revenue, whether you are talking about tax revenue or resource revenue. Now, debt in and of itself is not a problem, but if we're spending this to service, our debt, to pay salaries and on overhead or on productive capital expenditure, then this is a cause for concern for Nigerians, including, someone like me.
Now, Mr. Oyedele, now looking at the fact that the country's revenue to GDP ratio has remained low, according to some, comparing this to the likes of Ghana, Kenya, Angola, and even South Africa, and even for advanced climes like the United States of America, 30.6%, our low revenue base and juxtaposing that to debt service revenue ratio is also high. Now, in response to all of these challenges, the federal government is saying that, well, it has instituted strategies and legislation to increase and diversify revenues. You look at some of the top 5 debtors we have for last year: Lagos, Ogun, Imo State, River State, and within the states, these are states where we see the most, what do we say now, the most development, so to speak. But do you think, going by the calculation of revenue to GDP ratio the government is looking at, or like you've also said, looking at debt service ratio and a whole lot more, what calculation would you say paints the best picture for government to now critically take a look at how it borrows, the pattern it borrows, and then what it's exactly used for? Because we need deliverables at the end of the day. You've mentioned the fact that, yes, we have to borrow, but we need deliverables. For these top 5 states now, how do you see things transforming, and how do we now calculate much more preferably the state of the economy and the performance we see?
Yes, good question. So I think we have to adopt as a country, both at the federal and sub-national levels, what I call the integrated strategy. The integrated strategy has to be that aligns our revenue to our spending and by extension our debts. If you leave one of these out, or you manage it in a disjointed manner, you will never get the results that you really want or that the people really deserve. So what happens is, if you think about it, across all the states in Nigeria, their budget, total budget size is in the region of 9 trillion naira. And these states in IGR generate around 1.3 trillion. And the amount they share from federation accounts is somewhere in the region of 2.3 to 2.5. So in other words, the total revenue profile of the states in Nigeria is under 4 trillion, but they tend to budget almost 9 trillion, which means that even the planning itself, could have been done better. So they don't seem to put a lot of diligence into how they plan on what they spend. And having said that as well, you also find that, not only do we have a revenue problem, we have the spending problem. Spending problem in the sense that many of the projects are padded, so they are inflated. Many of them are not completed on time. When you have projects that are abandoned or delayed in execution, what happens is you incur the cost, you're paying the interest charges, but you're not getting the benefit. And therefore, it becomes a net negative for society. And you also have a lot of projects that I'll say haven't been prioritized. When you have a state building an airport, when they don't have primary schools, they can't provide water, they don't have roads, you just question the priority of that state. And then that comes to the question of what are you borrowing for, and how do you service the debt, and how do you ensure that it is sustainable. Globally, as at the end of 2020, the ratio of debt to GDP for the public sector was over 100%. It's about 105%. So that ratio in itself is not the problem for Nigeria, but we have to move away from that because many of the countries around the world don't borrow at double digits. So many countries borrow at next to nothing. In fact, there are countries that borrow at negative interest rate. We can't compare ourselves with them. Nigeria has to start focusing on two things. One is net financial position. So when you borrow, what are you spending it on? And is it increasing the value for Nigerian and the Nigerian people as well as the states if that borrowing was done at the state level? The second thing that we need to consider and focus on is this debt service cost as a ratio of revenue is really important. Now, if you combine all of that, the story is that for the different states, including the top 5 on your list, the stories are different. If you think about, a state like Lagos, high IGR, share of FAC is also sizable. IGR somewhere around 420 billion as of 2020. You say maybe not too much to worry about, but you have to ensure that you don't continue to borrow faster than you're growing your revenue. If you take a state like Kaduna State has one of the highest external borrowing, but you can see the infrastructure, not only the hard infrastructure, but the soft infrastructure. They harmonized their tax laws. They've increased their IGR by over 300% over the past 5 years. They've improved the ease of doing business. So you say a state like Kaduna has done well, no matter, regardless of the fact that they have borrowed. If you take a state like Ekiti, their IGR is one of the lowest, but yet they have a lot of borrowing domestically. So, but I do not think that Nigerians are paying enough attention to how we manage our debt, particularly at the state level. A lot of focus is on the federal government, which is fine. But we just need to start interrogating how monies are being borrowed and spent even at the sub-national level, so that overall we can be efficient in the utilization of revenue and resources for our country. For example, Section 125 of the Constitution requires that there should be public account that should be audited and laid before the House of Assembly or the National Assembly, as the case may be, on a yearly basis. You can count on your fingertips how many states even have audited accounts. And when there's no transparency, chances of mismanagement and fraud and all of that is very, very escalated.
Exactly. Mr. Oyedele, you've already tilted into my next question now in terms of following the money, instilling much more accountability and also transparency. We really have to look at our performance markers and also take them much more seriously. And in terms of safeguards as well, you made mention of the fact that we have to see public spending much more audited. But what safeguards or measures do you think the DMO can put in place now to ensure that borrowings are deployed to the capital projects that they are set to be for? Because there is this ongoing trust deficit that we have, which no magic wand can wave away unless we see what these monies are used for. How do we begin to consciously, at local government levels, state levels, and even the federal level, follow these monies closely, nip in the bud any element of corruption, and ensure that we have transparency and accountability to the people, the masses, whose taxpayers' monies are what accrue to all of these monies that these exploitative elements here think is free cash?
Yeah, so there is a very significant trust deficit between the people and our leaders, particularly the politicians, and it's really unfortunate. And in one of the studies that the NESD did around tax morale, about 2 or 3 years ago, we also discovered, sadly, but maybe not surprising, that the tax morale of Nigerians is one of the lowest we have seen anywhere in the world. Nearly 83% of Nigerians don't think there's anything wrong in not paying your taxes. And when we ask them why, the number one reason is they do not trust government. Number two reason is, what do we get in exchange for the taxes we pay? And you cannot deny all these issues. But again, we cannot have a society if we decide that you do wrong and I'll do my own wrong as well. Two wrongs, they say, do not make it right. I think in terms of trying to address these issues around borrowing and how we manage our resources, particularly when we borrow, I do not think that we can leave it to government or maybe the debt management office or the state government, because I don't know whether they have the incentives to do anything differently. I think it has to be driven by the people. It has to be driven by the organized private sector, the civil society, the media, and professionals, middle class like us, because the vast majority of our poor people are not in a position to hold anybody to account. Other than we need to encourage ourselves that when we have the opportunity, particularly during pre-election period like we have in 2022 now, let's use that opportunity to start asking those questions. Simple questions like, how much revenue have you generated? Where is the account? How much did you spend in building the road? Don't tell us to clap for you because you built a road. You applied for the job, you got the job. You're not spending your money, you're spending our money. Then you should be accountable to be able to tell us this is how much you've spent. And we can then query whether that is the best way to spend the money, whether you have been efficient or whether there has been some corruption embedded into those contracts. So we all have a stake, and we should take it as our duty to begin to ask for these questions. I think it was Bismarck that said, like in economics, when there's demand, there's supply. If you don't demand for accountability, you are likely to get the supply from the politicians.
Now, wrapping up our conversation at this point in time, let's also look at exploring the capital market much more aggressively to ensure we have a robust funding base, and also looking at states' areas of comparative advantages. What do you think are the blind spots that continue to wave this air or this mist of darkness for state governments really to look much more in-depthly into their resource base and then use these as areas of comparative advantages? We have areas where we could produce cocoa, oil palm, and a whole lot more. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic made us smell the coffee forcefully and look inwards. Now we have the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Commodity prices are skyrocketing. We are having energy crisis all around the country. It's time for Nigeria to play big. It was quite interesting to see the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Timipre Silva, also call on the United States to now come invest in Nigeria to ensure that we can now tap a little more into our gas reserves and then supply the United States and then the likes of Europe to ensure that we have these resources well utilized. But do you think we have to wait till the dying minutes when things are going virtually wrong before we take any action?
No, we shouldn't wait. Waiting until things get really, really bad can be very costly for us, and we pray that we don't get a point of no return, because if this country goes up in flame, everybody will find that whatever it is that they have saved, whether it's stolen or legitimate, will be completely meaningless. So we all have to take this very seriously, that for us to have a country, we need to improve how we manage and govern ourselves. I'm talking about competitive advantage. I do think that all the states in Nigeria have a gold mine that they have decided to mismanage, and that gold mine is land. So land is predominantly owned by states in Nigeria. You go to the US, that we like to refer to, states don't even own up to 10% of land. In Nigeria, you own almost 100%. There's personal income tax is entirely collectible by states. But what you get in Nigeria is completely mismanaged. I just returned from Rwanda and had some interactions with their government agencies, including the Rwanda Revenue Authority. And these guys have so mapped everywhere in Rwanda. Every single plot has a unique identification number that they can see on their dashboard. If you haven't paid your land levies, there's a red flag on the property. In fact, they can zoom and see the image of the property. Can you imagine that? And we can't even do that in Nigeria. To even transfer title to property is a nightmare, because some people are benefiting from the chaos. If we reform that, you'll be amazed at the amount of prosperity and progress, and by extension revenue, that government can generate. Capital market, like you mentioned, is also another opportunity. Unfortunately, the subnationals don't pay attention. There's an expiration as of 2nd of January this year of exemption on bonds by state government and corporates. It has expired now, which means if a state government is issuing a bond today, it's more expensive than it was last year. And this exemption is still applicable to the federal government. Why are they not asking questions? So overall, we have to think about the principle or the foundational principle of, at the end of the day, revenue and taxation are a percentage or fraction of the prosperity of enterprises and individuals. When we make doing business easy and we facilitate progress and prosperity for our people and our businesses, then government will generate revenue on a sustainable basis.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. We've been speaking with Mr. Taiwo Oyedele. He's the Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers. We hope government is listening. Definitely, this forthcoming election is also going to affect the body language of state government as well, especially with response to the debt profiles and how well we also see this utilization of resource base to ensure that we don't just continue to go down this whole unending spiral of borrowing. We need to do better. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.